Hello and welcome to our weekly webinar series with Passion4Moms, Mothers Are Leaders. And today I am excited to have my friend Jane Hampton Cook. She is a multi-author. She's written several books. And she's going to tell us a little bit about who she is, but I'm really excited to dive in and have a conversation about how history impacts our present day challenges. So Jane, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and then we'll dive right in.
Sure. Well, I have 10 books in the marketplace, and most of them are about historical people or stories from our nation's history. And then and I have 3 sons, and so for a while I was kind of one-to-one, one book, one child, and then now I have a lot more books. But I really wanted to, I was working for President George W. Bush when he was governor of Texas, and he really liked Sam Houston, and I was his webmaster, and I got interested, and so I decided to write a book about Sam Houston and his daughter and how Sam Houston chose not to take the oath to the Confederacy. And so that was sort of my test case to see if I could really write. And so my goal was that after I started having kids, I would write books. And because I realized that writing was really my passion and storytelling. And then when I was President Bush's webmaster in the White House, I realized that the historical stories about people in the White House was a very bipartisan topic. So I could post that information and not, and really bring more people to the website in a bipartisan way. And so that's really kind of how I got my start in doing historical work, was from that point on.
Well, and what a feat to be able to say that you have authored 10 books. I remember having a conversation with you when I wrote my first and right now my only book, working on some more. But yes, that's a huge accomplishment. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And you just have a new book coming out just recently, or is about to come out. Tell us about that one.
It's called Resilience on Parade, Short Stories of Suffragists and Women's Battle for the Vote. And what it does is it starts in 1776 and ends in 1920. And through the eyes of 8 Americans, you get the story of how women won the battle for the vote. So I have Abigail Adams, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, but each person represents a different character trait or a different virtue. And so that's one way that it makes it timeless. And Sojourner Truth was all about perseverance. Ida B. Wells was about resilience. Susan B. Anthony was about flexibility and switching tactics when necessary, courage, creativity. So those values that we do want to pass along to our kids, when you write about historical people and find something authentic in their life, then that helps make something that seems, old and a long time ago more real and relevant.
That's so good. And I have some questions I want us to really dive into and how that even impacts our life today and as mothers and women and creating and being a part of history. But before I do that, let's have a little fun just of getting to know you a little bit more. Do you have a particular maybe story or something, because you've done a lot, you've worked with Governor Bush, and then when he was in the White House, you've done a lot of media, a lot of writing with 10 books. Is there anything in the writing process or your career of an interesting story or maybe a practical lesson that stands out of something that you've gained on the other side of a really remarkable career you've had?
Well, I've learned to be flexible, and I've learned to adapt, a 400-page book into a 3-minute segment on Fox News or C-SPAN or CNN. And I've learned to take something that's, that seems old, but make it relevant and put greater context into something. And I've also learned that, you know, a lot of people want to write, but they're afraid to because they're afraid of writer's block, or they're not sure how to push through. And what I've learned over the years is that even if I'm writing badly, I need to write. So if it's time to write something, and even if it's not flowing, I can always go back and fix it. And so I've learned to just kind of push through in that process. And then I'm just a much more nimble writer now because I've not let that block, you know, get to me. So, you know, and I've also had to learn when it comes to doing television is that a lot of times you don't get a lot of notice. So I've learned how to kind of quickly pull together material for whatever the topic, you know, might be. And right before COVID, I did almost a weekly segment on Fox and their Fox and Friends First. And we did President's Day. We talked about, you know, New Hampshire, the primaries were going on then. So I learned to just take a little fact from then to show how, you know, it's relevant to what's going on now.
And that's such a practical gift, I think, to be able to think quickly on your feet and be able to have really good content quickly. So I think that's an amazing gift that probably makes you a better in your career, but better also just in life as a mom, and, you know, all the avenues that we have to juggle. So it's a really practical gift to be able to think quickly but also have good content.
Right, exactly. And to think quickly on your feet, and sort of it's performance, right? So it's learning how to perform. And I didn't realize, but I learned how to do that when I was in, you know, 12, 13. I'd have opportunities to give a little talk, or even just standing up in front of your class. Those are really important skills for our kids. And I don't think I would have had the confidence to even try TV when I was first asked to do it if I hadn't had, you know, practice doing drama in high school, or, you know, the different things that I look back on. I think, oh, that gave me the confidence, you know, to get up and speak in front of other people.
Yeah, it's amazing how all the little things that we don't really think are helping create who we are, and the things that our kids are doing are helping shape and mold them into having gifts and talents that they'll definitely use for a lifetime.
Right.
What, so you mentioned, before we dive into your book, you mentioned about your book on resilience. I have some specific questions I want to explore with that, of how I think it impacts our world today. But what would you say, if we're just looking more big picture before we hone in, big picture, some people could maybe say, I'm not really into history. I'm not a historian. I'm not an author. And so maybe this doesn't necessarily, you know, touch them in a passion. But what would you say is a practical life lesson that we all should embrace the value of history? Maybe we don't choose to pick up a history book to read as pleasure, but there's value in learning from the past, because as we know, even in the Bible, Ecclesiastes says, nothing is new under the sun, right? And so everything repeats itself some way, somehow, with the baseline.
Right.
So why would you say it's important for us to understand and appreciate history?
So we all have our own personal history, right? We grew up, we had a family, we went to school, and our children have history. Yesterday was history in your family's life. And I've watched some Hallmark movies to kind of give myself a break from some of the stress of the world and the news and whatnot. And there was a Hallmark movie that I watched a couple of weeks ago called The Perfect Bride. And she said something that I thought, that's why I like history. And so she talked about how I embraced the things from my past that made me strong, and I let go of the things that held me back. And I think we are teaching our kids something about history, whether we realize it or not. And if we are holding on to those things in our personal past that that, held us back or that didn't make us strong, our kids pick up on that. But if we're teaching them to say, hey, let's look at what was really good and strong yesterday and what was positive, and let's, move forward and put the other aside. And I don't think that means that you never talk about difficult things or sad things, but I just don't think you let that hang on and define who you are today. And I thought that was just a really good, it really encapsulated the way I look, at history. And I've had the opportunity to talk to my sons about my parents' personal history. They both grew up at times where they had a lot of poverty. My dad was living in the back of a church with his family. My mother told me at one point the only thing they could afford to eat was scrambled eggs. That was the only thing that they could get from the grocery store. And so I realize now, wow, my parents really overcame poverty, and they lived a middle-class life as adults. They both worked hard. And so it's not that I want my kids to wallow in past poverty, but to take courage that my parents persevered and they overcame that. And in my mom's life, the pandemic really brought this out to me. And I did some research and wrote an article for The Hill about the polio epidemic, because my mom lost the use of a shoulder when she was 4 years old. She was permanently altered because of the polio epidemic. Wow. But she became a March of Dimes poster child in Little Rock, Arkansas. She had her picture taken in the newspaper at a basketball game. And I put that in my book in the foreword and dedicated it to her, because I realized my mother showed resilience. Every day she was bouncing back. She didn't let the fact that she couldn't, raise her arm over her head stop her from doing the activities of a mom and as a wife and as a teacher. And so that's where we look at our personal history, our family's history, and see how things in the past have made us strong, and we persevere. And that's the same way I like to approach American history, is to look at people and things in the past, but show their relevance in how maybe they contributed to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, those kinds of things, building our country. But they also, overcame things as well.
That's so good. And even as you mentioned, the pandemic, that we're in today, and your mom walking through the polio pandemic, I think it's really important that you, as you pointed out, that we do embrace the situation and not let it define us. Because right. We all have an attitude choice. We all have a choice in how even individually all of our lives are being affected, but we don't have to let that impact define us negatively. It can be a part of our story, and it will be a part of our story.
Right.
But just like your mom, she was personally impacted, but didn't let that stop or define her. And so what a valuable lesson.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And there were people that would meet her that didn't realize that she had, had overcome polio. And then they might see her move around a little differently, but, she wasn't letting it hold her back. So.
That's so good. And what an incredible reminder to us all, because we all are going to have challenges in our lives, and we all are walking through a global pandemic. And so just the beauty of, how we have a choice, and how we let circumstances be a part of the story, but not define us negatively.
Exactly.
So as you have studied history, in your book With Resilience, I am a huge advocate of grit and resilience. I think that just kind of as we lead into this question, one of my passions has been for, even with parenting, for us to move past the helicopter hovering and the snowplow parent of trying to remove all obstacles for our kids. I actually coined a phrase that I wrote an article about last year, trampoline parenting, of that visual of being able to bounce back, right? We want our kids to be able to face a challenge. Even in today's world, they are having to face a global pandemic. Their normals are no longer normals.
Right.
I have a senior in high school that, you know, what used to be a normal senior class experience will not be a normal senior class experience. But how do we have that resilience and grit to, again, let's charge forward. We're in a crisis. We're in a challenging situation, but we're not going to just sit and feel sorry for ourselves. We're not going to wallow in misery. And so how do you teach your children to have that resilience? And I'm sure you learned really valuable lessons from the women that you studied, but it's a really important lesson for us as moms to teach our children that grit and resilience in life.
Right, exactly. And, you know, I could have named the book, you know, Perseverance, or I could have picked Courage, because, you know, all of these Americans demonstrated those, but it really was resilience that stood out to me. And so one of the chapters is called Resilience on Parade. And that's why I made the book that title. And it really was because I realized, you know, it's in the big topic, women winning the right to vote. It lasted decades. But each of these people who were on that big overarching story had to demonstrate personal resilience. And, you know, Susan B. Anthony is one of the people that I write about. And there was high hopes that after the Civil War, because the women had been calling for the right to vote, that women would get the right to vote after the Civil War, and that didn't happen. And in fact, the word male got put into the Constitution for the first time, which meant that in order for women to get the right to vote, female had to be added to the Constitution. And so Susan B. Anthony never stopped trying. And she went to Congress and lobbied for a constitutional amendment. She met with presidents. She met with all sorts of people. She gave all sorts of speeches. And then one day she just decided she was going to vote. She was going to try it. And she ended up testing the judicial system in the process. And it gave her, she lost her court case, but it gave her an opportunity to explain, I'm a US citizen, and that is the reason why I should have the right to vote. And why women in particular, you know, needed it, because they viewed that women realized that if they had the ability to hold their leaders accountable through the electoral process, then some of the other laws that discriminated against women could be changed. And so it was really the conduit through which other things flowed. And so, but she just, throughout her life, she showed resilience. And they did see some successes. Some states did move through Susan B. Anthony's influence. Wyoming gave women the right to vote, but not all of them. And so it wasn't until the next generation that the 19th Amendment was passed. But you can see her commitment. And like I was talking to someone yesterday who's a presidential historian, and he was asking me about her meeting with Chester Arthur, the president. He goes, you know, today nobody really knows who Chester Arthur is, but we all know who Susan B. Anthony is. You know, we've heard of her. Right. So I thought that was interesting. But it just, you know, just keeping at it and trying and pursuing a goal and trying a different angle. You know, and sometimes resilience might be, if you lose a job, you might end up retraining and going into a little different field. You know, it can mean a lot of different things, but I think it's at the root of it, it's creativity and having creative problem solving skills. And that's something I've been working with, especially on my youngest son, is how can we solve this problem? Let's think outside the box and, you know, move forward through the solution, you know, that we come up with together. So.
And right now, more than ever, we're having to be creative moving forward in the world. Something you said also struck a chord with me, because I think as we teach our children resilience, you referenced about how Susan B. Anthony was actively trying to make a difference, but it wasn't until the next generation that the outcome came about.
Right.
I think as moms, it can be sometimes we can not always be forward thinking as
Mhm.
parents. And
That's true.
I personally like to be a very forward thinker of, when my kids were babies, I was already thinking about, what do I want them to look like, and having certain qualities when they're 18 and are leaving home. So as an infant and as a toddler, I was very intentional to think, how do I want them to end up when they leave home? And then I had to backtrack and have a game plan about how to get there. And so a lot of that is having a game plan for, what do you want in life? What do you want for your children as a parent? What goals do you want to accomplish with them? You know, in all the different ramifications as they're growing into a young adult. Oftentimes as moms, what I see is that moms can be stuck in the rut of only seeing today, because she can't get far enough above the clouds to see the big picture.
Right.
Stuck in the diapers and the maybe the challenges of toddlers or the challenges of teens, instead of being forward thinking. And so again, just as you referenced, you know, Susan B. Anthony, it wasn't until that next generation that you saw the results. So what would you say, even as we relate that to parenting, the importance of recognizing that the influence and impact that we're making in our families, the investment in our children, and the impact in the world around us, whether it's in our neighborhoods or our careers, that it's really important to be mindful that we're not always going to see the results immediately or today.
Right. And it's that perspective taking. And, you know, sometimes it's easier to make one decision when it's about your kids, but realizing that, okay, there's a skill that they need here, and they don't have this skill. So how can I teach them that skill? And for my youngest son, I find myself doing that a lot and trying to figure out, okay, he lacks the skill of pushing through something hard. You know, he said to the other day, he was really upset because he needed to read a book for summer school and he didn't want to do it. And he said, well, reading is boring. So I was trying to figure out, well, why does he think that, you know? And then some kids say that when reading really is too hard. And I don't think, and I said, and then I thought, well, I don't think that's it. I think he lacks the skill of pushing through something that's boring, you know? And so I'm trying to figure out how to help him do that and kind of have that focus of sticking with it. But you're right. And you've always been really good about the proactive parenting and really thinking about proactively what your children need. And it's not always, you know, we think sometimes of, you know, sports and things. It's not always just about learning that skill about how to hit the ball. It's about what it means to be a part of a team, because you want your child to be able to work on a team when they're an adult. That's for them to be a team player. And so it's really looking at what these activities are teaching, maybe what they aren't, and what maybe, you know, you need to kind of fill that in. And you're right, we don't always see the labor of our work. You know, we don't always see the fruits of what seeds we're sowing in our kids. And but that's where sometimes looking at family history and realizing that, oh, you know, my grandparents were the first to graduate from college in their family, and now it's just expected. You know, the fruit of that is there's a habit now and a pattern that our family expects their children to go to college. You know, so that's just even something really simple. But that's the fruit of that kind of commitment.
And it's again combining that creativity of, you know, the world's a big world, and there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of place for growth and creativity, but also then when we bring it home of what kind of children we want, what kind of adult do we want in that boardroom, what kind of moral compass do we want them to have, because that adult was once a child, and you know, we learn our moral compass, and we learn
Right.
things about adulthood in our families. And that's why I just think it's really important to know what you're wanting long term, and then put it in bite-sized pieces, you know, backing it up along the way.
Right.
And so being able to work, you know, slowly and methodically, but you're being intentional of like, I actually have a goal in mind of what we need in the world, you know, through each of our families and our children.
Right.
You talked a lot about in learning resilience, several different character traits. Tell me a little bit more about maybe some of the other women that stand out to you, because I think another really exciting thing as I've been doing these webinar series is highlighting women, but highlighting the value that motherhood is a leadership opportunity. Because so often, you know, one of the things that I really don't like is when moms just say, well, I'm just a mom, or I just a stay-at-home mom, but they aren't seeing the value of motherhood is leadership. And so because we have the opportunity to impact and have our, you know, fingerprints all over the next generation as far as the things that we're doing today. So as you studied these amazing women, I think, well, we have a lot of amazing women that we rub shoulders with in our culture today. So what are some of those character traits that we can learn from in history that are things that we should really hold on to and value as women today?
So the first person that really comes to my mind on that is Abigail Adams. And in the book, in Resilience on Parade, I talk about her taking initiative, and that she really valued education. She studied a lot, and back then girls, you know, learned to read at home. But she really dove into books and just absorbed literature and really was very well read. And she and John Adams, her husband, had a very intellectual relationship. And he at one point said to her, "I love to watch you think." And that they just had this chemistry that was very intellectual. And so there's one point where John Adams lost an opportunity to go to Canada because he couldn't speak French. So he writes Abigail and he says, "Teach our children, our sons and our daughter French," because he knew she could speak French. So she imparted that to her kids, and her son, John Quincy Adams, learned French as a 10-year-old, and then ended up going over to France with his dad and started teaching his dad's new friends English, like his new French. So, and then of course, John Quincy Adams grew up to become president of the United States. And he wouldn't have been able to do that if his mother had not valued education and had not taken initiative with him on numerous topics. And in the book, she takes initiative in the story in the book about asking her husband to remember the ladies as he's helping to make a new code for the United States. And she really wanted women to have it better. And she had the confidence and courage to take that initiative and raise the issue. And Adams, at first, they teased about it. They kind of make it a playful banter. But then within about 2 months, he actually has a really serious discussion with another attorney about who should be able to vote. And even though it was, you know, nothing really changed concretely about who could vote at that time, because there were a lot of men who couldn't vote, regardless of their race. About 84% of the American population was not eligible to vote in the beginning. And even though it didn't produce immediate fruit, that debate, people took that debate and they began to make changes because of it, and realized, oh, okay, not everyone who owns land, that shouldn't be the only reason why you're able to vote. And those laws began to change. And but it was real, you know, to Abigail taking that initiative and having that conversation with her husband led to a greater debate. And so I think taking initiative is just a really important quality. And I realized that one of my kids was having trouble with self-advocacy with teachers at school. And I'd say to him, "Why don't you go talk to your teacher about that?" "No, I don't want to. No, I can't." And so, and I realized one year I was helping this particular child with a lot of homework. And so he needed some more skills, executive function skills. And so the next year we enrolled him in a study hall, a class where that proactively taught those skills. And then I don't think I rarely helped him with homework, and taking initiative was one of the things that they taught in that class.
Wow.
To be more self-advocate. Go to your teacher when you don't understand something, if you don't quite go, and how to do it respectfully. And so sometimes I think it's realizing that, oh, maybe we don't have the skills to teach them specific things, but somebody else does.
Right.
So
that's so good. Are there any other character traits that you've studied that stand out to you?
Well, one of the people that I write about, I've been wanting to write about this person for a long time, and had written a story and a collection of other stories that just didn't get published. But one of them is Sojourner Truth. And she was born into slavery, but she was freed when she was in her late 20s, maybe almost 30. But she wrote about her slave story, and it was published by an abolitionist. And her slave story is pretty tough to read. I mean, she was beaten, she was separated from all her siblings were sold away. It really does give you a picture of the darkness, of slavery. But what stood out to me was how her faith grew and how she persevered. Her name was Isabella when she was born, and her mother taught her the Lord's Prayer and taught her to pray and said, if you ever get separated from us and you're alone, you can always go out under the stars and pray. Well, for a long time, so Isabella thought that the only way that God could hear her is if she shouted. So she had this little island that she would go out to pray, and she would shout because she didn't understand that God could hear her. And then when she was freed, a group of Quakers took her in, and they taught her the Bible, and they helped fill in some of those gaps for her in the area of faith, and she grew. And she felt that God had called her to be a minister, to preach his truth. So she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. And she was an avid, very active abolitionist. And she was also an active suffragist, someone who was calling for women's right to vote. And one of her most memorial speeches was called "Ain't I a Woman?", where she really, it was a very powerful, emotionally well-delivered, amazingly delivered speech. And so her story stands out to me for a lot of reasons, but just to see that change in faith, going from this childlike understanding to becoming a minister. And she ended up meeting Abraham Lincoln and had a meeting with him in the White House. That was kind of she prayed that God would let her meet the great emancipator. And so that's the end, that was sort of a culmination of her prayer, that she could meet Lincoln. And he died 6 months after she met him. So anyway, so that's one of the stories, but it's a story of perseverance, but also you can see how someone's faith grew despite some really terrible hardship. So.
And what an incredible story. I as I'm listening to you, I'm just thinking, wow, these are the kinds of things that make you want to be a better reader and better educated on just understanding all the amazing people that have gone before us.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
A wealth of knowledge and people who have impacted the world we live in. We have the world today that we live in because of those people.
Exactly. That's right. And because, and I was thinking about it, the first 15 states in the United States, 10 of them, by the time you get to 1800, had taken steps to restrict or abolish slavery. And Sojourner Truth was one of the beneficiaries of that. And just how kind of the dominoes, how because there were slaves like her who were freed, their stories were used to convince other people that slavery was wrong. And even though it seems like a slow process by our standards, it was an incremental process. And so today we can kind of look back and see that big overarching incremental process. and how the big things that we know, like the 13th Amendment and the Civil War, wouldn't have been able to happen had those 10 states not taken action against slavery. Mm-hmm. And so, and then to see a person like Sojourner Truth play such a pivotal role in it all, is really, fascinating. But I think the thing about learning about history is looking for stories that, and looking for books that bring out people's personal stories that's told maybe from their point of view, rather than just kind of a dull, fact-driven, encyclopedia-driven way of doing things. And I wrote a book a few years ago called Stories of Faith and Courage from the Revolutionary War, and it's a devotional book. So you can read one every day, but it takes you through the American Revolution, and you get to meet a lot of people that you would never have heard of. Ministers, because I wondered, how did people of faith decide to turn against their king? Like, that's a crisis of faith, right? And so I found several sermons and realized, they talked about Moses and the Israelites and Pharaoh, and compared America and King George to that story. Mm-hmm. And that's where they drew some of their strength from. And so that's what makes, to me, history exciting, is to sort of see things in it that, we still need to hear, today. So
how can we as educators and parents do a better job of helping provide that importance of history and learning from those who have gone before us, learning from the past, because it does impact the challenges that we're faced with today? So how can we as educators and families do a better job of teaching our children and having a better value system around history and learning from those who have already gone before us?
So I think, encouraging them to read more books. If they have to do a book report on someone, maybe choose someone who, is really significant in history. I think also, there are films out there. There's a good series called Liberty Kids. It's older, but it's very accurate. And we have watched that series. It's a PBS series that I think you can probably watch it now on Amazon Prime. But it's really, really good, and it's very child friendly. And it, there are series out there like that can teach you. In fact, Austin, my older son, came to me and goes, "Who is that guy that we watched?" And he was a spy, and we talked about, it was James Armistead, and he had watched it in Liberty Kids. And we were talking about how we might not have won the Revolutionary War without James Armistead, who was a slave who spied on the British and gave really critical intelligence that led to the final battle. And so I think some of it too, from my point of view, is making sure that the next book that I write, the next things that I focus on, really bring out those integrated stories of people that did live, and took risk, that write it in a relevant way. Mm-hmm.
As we are in the midst of a global pandemic, what would you say are lessons? Obviously resiliency, but is there something that you would say that, as you navigate this personally and with your career and as a family, of something that you have seen play out over time in history that helps you kind of see the bigger picture of the global pandemic that we're faced with today? Because it's not just America, it's the whole world, which, affects our careers, our finances, the economics, and as well as even now with education and schools starting back up. So, it's having a real impact on touching everything.
Right. Yeah.
What can we learn?
Well, I wrote an article for The Hill, a couple of them, I think, on the pandemic, and putting it into some historical context. And, going back, I looked back at other epidemics, the yellow fever epidemic, the the polio the epidemics of the polio. And what I realized is American ingenuity when it comes to technology and science and how fast it is now. It was really slow to find a polio vaccine, but average Americans pooled their resources, their dimes, literally through the March of Dimes, to raise money for that research. And just that gives me courage, because I think there are smart people out there who are actively looking at a vaccine. There are numerous therapies now that they know a lot more about, and know a lot more about their effectiveness and when to give certain medications in the process of the disease. And that's what I think gives me encouragement, is that, there are a lot of people working really, really hard on this disease to find out how to treat it and who's most vulnerable. And that gives me comfort, actually, because we're not just sitting around doing nothing. And then, we are having to be creative in going back to school, and things are going to be different. And my youngest, will be going 2 days a week and 2 days at home. And so that's an adjustment for us. And I worry about the parents where both of them are committed to full-time jobs. And I work for myself, so I'm a little more flexible, but it does give me courage. And, sometimes things are a cautionary tale. At the beginning of the pandemic, I did a Fox interview and talked about the yellow fever. It was based on my article, and how Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson had different views on the yellow fever, and how sometimes we can get kind of caught up in conflict, and that's not necessarily the healthiest thing when we're dealing with a pandemic, and to take politics out of some of that stuff. And so, there's a lot, that we can kind of glean from the experiences of the past. And also, I think it helps to know that just America has gone through some of this before. Right. Even though it's been a really long time, that we did get through the yellow fever epidemic that killed a good number of people in Philadelphia, for example. And that God can work through that. I mean, Dolley Madison lost her first husband to the yellow fever epidemic. And she married James Madison about a year later. He was a congressman, and she didn't let that hold her back, and she lived a full life, and she became the first lady. And I write about her in my book, The Burning of the White House. And so, you can look back and see good that came out of difficulty, right. And tragedy, and that you can see how someone she was very charismatic and very charming, and she didn't, again, it goes back to that idea of not letting something bad hold us back.
The resilience.
Yeah, exactly.
As I'm listening to you talk, I would be curious if you had any thoughts. I think as we talk about this from a global point of view, and how we make that personal in our homes as mothers with our family. Another angle that I had not given a lot of necessarily thought about, but something that just happened in our family yesterday, is we were in a place of business, and there was a young man in his 20s who had struck up a conversation with my daughter just about school and what going back to school would look like on the collegiate level. And
right.
And he was wanting to know her thoughts about just, wow, the world seems really messed up right now. And it was much more of that fearful base of just what do you think about this? And initially she gave, more of just kind of a polite answer, and he's like, no, but what do you really think? Because the world's crazy right now. And she had an opportunity to point him to Jesus and give him the opportunity to recognize the big picture of understanding, God's sovereign, and how we have the opportunity to renew our minds daily, of recognizing that as believers, we know who sits on the throne, that God sits on the throne. And so I'm thinking about also for all of our children and the young adults, as they're walking through history being made.
Right.
What does that look like as far as advice you would give them of, again, they're in the middle of walking through history, and many of them are fear-based. Many of them are thinking the world's falling apart.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a tough one. You know, we've listened to different sermons from different people. We've taken the opportunity with churches being closed to kind of listen to some people that we might not have listened to before. And I think that has helped us as a family, because we've talked about how this minister's approached this topic. And one of the ones that we listened to recently talked about that very thing, about how complex our culture is, and how when you turn on the news, you know, it's so difficult sometimes to watch the news, and how terrifying things can be. And yet, you know, he talked about David, and David was in that place where his culture was falling apart, but yet he chose to praise God, and he chose to look at the good in things. And so, you know, some of that is, I think, looking at, you know, what God has done in the immediate. You know, even though you weren't able to go to school, you've connected with some of your friends on Zoom on the off days that you didn't have school in a way that you might not have before.
Right.
You know, and one of my sons is starting a fantasy football league with one of his friends. He's taking initiative, and, you know, just that your life, that God has a plan for your life, and that, you know, he wants you to grow and develop these skills and talents that he's given you, and he's got a plan for you. And maybe you're going to do a few college classes online, and maybe that's not all bad. You know, maybe there's some, you know, you might have a little more time to study because you're not commuting to school, or you're, you know, like trying to find the good in the circumstance, and seeing God's hand, you know, in the circumstance. And, you know, for me, I'm realizing I need to turn the news off a little bit, because if it's draining me, and I keep up with it so that if I get a call, I know what's current and what's going on. But I've realized, okay, maybe I've overdone it. And so, you know, just even admitting that to my kids. Yeah, I've probably watched a little too much news, so we're going to do this instead.
Right.
You know, we're going to work a puzzle on the weekend, and we're going to turn off some things to keep our spirits, you know, up. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're almost out of time, but before we get to our last couple of questions, I just want to mention to our audience, if you have any questions for Jane, there is a Q&A button. You're welcome to type in any questions, and we'll try to save time if possible to answer any of those, but feel free to ask those, and we'll hopefully get to those before our time is up. Jane, what would you say is one character trait or something that you want your children to know at their core when they leave home? Like, what's something you really want them to know at their very core?
A character trait. I think that just the confidence that God loves them no matter what, and that he is with them wherever they go, and that they can have that perseverance because of God's providence. And so I learned a few years ago, you know, around where we live, there are a lot of things named Providence Elementary School, Providence this, Providence that. And it sort of, it doesn't have, it has kind of a good luck meaning sometimes to people. But I learned when I was writing stories of faith and courage from the Revolutionary War that it literally, back in the Revolution, meant God's presence. So when George Washington used it, for example, he talked about that providence guided them through the revolution, and that it was his presence was with them. And that he talked, you know, referring to Joshua 1, where be strong and courageous. and the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And so that really, I think more than any sort of concept, that has stuck with me as just a concept, to realize, okay, there were people 240 years ago who had this same faith and belief in God's presence,
right,
and that God will be with you, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's making a C in a class, whether it's losing a friend, to that God's presence enables us to be persevering. It enables us to be resilient. And I think that's one thing I hope that they take away from.
That's so good.
Yeah.
That's so good. And I love that definition of really understanding what providence means.
Yeah, and it wasn't even just this real big distance, God's just way up here. It was just really being with them. And, George Washington saw how there was this mysterious storm that concealed the movements of his army, and they got away. They left Long Island and made it to Manhattan, and it was a mysterious fog, and it was providential, because it concealed them, it preserved them, and it saved them. Because if that hadn't happened, they probably would have been fully cut off. So those kinds of things that he spoke rather formally by our standards, but just seeing that kind of thing stands out to me. So
that's powerful. I love that. I love that. I love just even thinking about providence in a whole new light now. So thank you for that. It's amazing. What would you say, I think, again, just in appreciating the value of motherhood and recognizing that we as moms have a profound impact on our children. You referenced your own mother and the battles that she overcame as a young girl with polio and growing up. What's something you look back on and really appreciate of a lesson that you learned from your mom?
My mom really listened to me. And I think my mom gave me a lot of empathy and affirmed, she helped me kind of, I guess, deal with my feelings, and I always felt like she understood me. And, I've thought about that. Like, I have one child that's a little more talkative than the others. I have three, but one of them in particular comes and talks and talks and talks. And, it's my youngest, and I've thought, my mom listened to me talk about who knows what, but that she was really empathetic, and I always felt like she understood me. So she must have just had this ability to connect with me on my level, so that I felt affirmed and understood. And one of the challenges that my youngest son has, empathy really is the way to help him overcome some of his challenges, is acknowledging and helping him express his feelings with words. And so, I think that comes from my mom. Just that realization was from her. And I appreciate that a lot about my mom.
Well, that's such an amazing reminder to all of us to recognize that our kids want to be heard, need to be heard, and taking the time to be present. And especially in today's culture and technology, how it's so easy for us to be absorbed in our phones or devices and to not give them that full 100% attention with our eyes and our ears, fully engaged. And so again, what a valuable reminder, because it does have a profound impact. I mean, think about that. That's one thing that you really appreciate.
Yeah. And I realize sometimes I could buy myself time. If one of my children is saying something to me, I don't fully understand where they're coming from, but I can just repeat exactly what they said to me. So you think this about this, and it buys me a little time to process a better answer maybe, but just that alone, I realize really helps them feel like you help them calm down in some cases, or helps them to understand. And you can see how that can really make a difference to them.
That's good. Well, Jane, we are almost out of time, and I so appreciate the time that you've given us, and just that amazing practical reminder of the value of history, that, you know, there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the past and glean as we go forward in the future, recognizing the value of the people who have paved the way for us. Do you have any closing remarks that you would like to share of just anything that would be exhorting us to continue on, of appreciating the value of the past in walking through today's challenges?
Well, you know, I think looking at your own family and your own personal past and thinking about things that you've overcome in your life, I think that can give you encouragement that, you know, you've been through other things, and just to take strength from those things, and to, again, not let the current situation define our identity, you know, moving forward. We're not going to be always dealing with a pandemic, you know, and that we don't need to let that change our identity in a negative way. And so just being positive. And I think that's a helpful way to look at it. So
that's so good. Well, Jane, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our audience members for listening. And again, what an amazing reminder that you as a mother are being a part of history today. And so as we continue to learn from the past and the character traits that we can glean and learn from, and hopefully teach in our own families and our own homes, as we as women and as mothers are making a difference in the world around us. So thank you, Jane, and everyone have a very blessed day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.